Hi, I am with Duma Gqubule, the founder of Center for Economic Development and Transformation. Duma is a well-known economist in South Africa and we'll be talking about the state of unemployment in the country. We are one of the most unequal societies in the world. The stats essay just said we currently have an unemployment rate of 43% and 75% amongst the youth. How did you get here?
Okay, Nontobeko, I just want to say two things. First of all, whichever way you slice the data, our economic performance since 1994 has been deeply disappointing. Our gross domestic product per capita, which is an imperfect measure, it's increased by only 17.6% over 27 years. That's about 0.7% a year. For example, if you compare with China over the same period, it's increased by about 800%. India has increased by 300%. So if you compare us with other large emerging markets, our economic performance has been dismal. There's no dodging this one. I was arguing with the senior ANC leader yesterday, and he was saying he doesn't agree with me that it's just deeply disappointing. But I say, how can you come to any other conclusion? The second thing, Nontobeko, is that our unemployment crisis is a national disgrace. It is the most heartbreaking betrayal of the promises and dreams of our liberation. The government has failed the people who fought for so long and so hard for a better life for all. And I don't know, you asked how we got here. I talk about 4 periods in the post-apartheid economy. In the first period, we had the GEAR policy, which was a neoliberal, self-imposed structural adjustment program called GEAR. Now, I just have to mention that at the time in 1996, when GEAR was started, there was no reason, there was no debt crisis, there was no inflation crisis, but the government decided to implement this policy called GEAR. Between 1996 and 2003, the number of unemployed people increased from 4.6 million to 8 million. The unemployment rate increased from 33% to 40.6%. That is what happened during those years. Now, when GEAR ends, the government starts spending again in the economy. This is what I'm saying that we should do. Government investment spending, for example, increased by 19% a year between 2003 and 2008. State-owned enterprise investment spending increased by 26% every year for 5 years. So what happened during GEAR? Some people say it's a commodity crisis, but they haven't looked at the data properly. It was a domestically driven boom where every sector in the economy created jobs except mining. We created 3.1 million jobs during this period. So by December 2008, during this boom in our economy, because we weren't implementing these contractionary macroeconomic policies, we created the jobs. Now, between 2009 and now, we have created 226,000 jobs. The labor force has increased by 5.7 million people since December 2008 to March 2021. So we're talking about 13 years where we haven't created any jobs. The number of unemployed people has increased by 5.5 million people. The unemployment rate for Black Africans is 48%. For Black African females, it's 51.15%. In the Eastern Cape and Limpopo, it's almost 50%. So this is a national calamity. And the sad thing about it is that government hasn't really done anything to address this crisis. The youth unemployment rate is 74.7%. But I've been following the presidency. He announced the Youth Employment Service in 2018, a month after he became president. And that thing was supposed to have created 1 million jobs. That thing has now created 55,000 jobs. So many initiatives announced from the presidency. These are just gimmicks, as I say, that will not address the unemployment problems. To address unemployment, there's a relationship between GDP growth and employment. So that's the first thing. We have to grow our economy faster. But we must look at the quality of our growth. It mustn't damage the environment. It mustn't exacerbate inequality. It must address gender inequality. So we can't just grow for the sake of it. We must address the quality of the growth as well. And the second thing, we have to change the structure of our economy. You know, one thing that really offends me with South Africans, when they say people are unemployable and that the problem is one of education and skills. That is complete garbage, you know. And let me just explain what I'm talking about. Since December 2008, we haven't created any jobs in our economy. So all the people who come out of the education system, there's no jobs for them. Are you telling me that there are 11 million jobs for people who are educated. No, there are not 11 million jobs for people who are educated. I did a projection at this rate, what it will take to create full employment where everyone has a job except the ones who don't want the jobs. By 2030, we have to create 17 million jobs. And we have to do that while reducing the carbon intensity of our economy and reducing emissions. We have to do that as well while eliminating these fossil fuel hotspots that you see in Mpumalanga, what you see in Sasolburg, and you see in Durban with the refineries. So that is a challenge that we face as a country. So we have to address this crisis head on. We cannot be pointing a water gun at a blazing house. So that's basically what I think of our unemployment initiatives. And the government also had another initiative called the Job Summit in 2018, I think, which was supposed to create 275,000 jobs a year. It hasn't created those jobs yet. So I think we have to get serious as a country, develop a proper economic development strategy that will create jobs for our people.
Duma, one of the things that worries me a lot is that it seems as if no one is bothered by this. You've had countries around the world that have had massive political and social turmoil, even revolutions, when unemployment rates have been even lower than ours currently. Yet we sit with this massive unemployment rate, and it's like
nothing has happened.
Nothing has happened. Why is that? Is it a racialized issue, like most things in South Africa? But even if it is, I feel as if even the black middle class is also not bothered by this.
I think the elite, the black elites, the white elites, the ruling class, they're not taking this thing seriously because you have been doing the same policies over and over again for 27 years. And for the past 10, 11 years, you've been saying structural reforms, you've been saying austerity. There is no result from these policies. It just gets worse every single year. And you keep on doing it. And I just can't understand it, Nonto. And we have to get serious as a country in developing a proper economic development strategy. And it has been done in East Asia. It's been done in countries like Ethiopia, Rwanda, more recently Vietnam, China. There are lessons that we can learn and adapt to our situation to create the proper economic growth strategy for our country.
Now that you mentioned that, I'm not an economist, so from a layman's perspective, I'm always confounded because you hear economists always talking about GDP, you hear about inflation, but I do not hear people talking about growth that will give people jobs. I come from Pietermaritzburg, and I remember as a kid, there were people who worked in the manufacturing firms there, when they made shoes, where they made wooden things and clothing. There were firms like that in Pietermaritzburg, but now they're not there. So what type of growth or policies do we need to have to make sure that people have jobs again? So we don't keep having this thing where you hear economists talking about a jobless growth. What is that? How can you have growth yet people don't have jobs? How can the GDP be good, yet people don't have jobs? Can you just explain to us in layman terms?
I'll start with the first one, because I also grew up in Pietermaritzburg. And I know that there were technical colleges in Pietermaritzburg where people were trained for these technical skills. And there were manufacturing companies, I think Tongaat and whatever, in that area. So, but I'm not saying things were better in those days, but one thing I don't understand is why the government shut all those technical schools. Those are some of the issues that I'm talking about. There wasn't jobless growth between 2003 and 2008. We created 3.1 million jobs. The unemployment rate went down from 40.6% to 28.7%. So it was not jobless growth. Yeah, there was jobless growth during the first period, the GEAR period between 1996 and 2003. The numbers show that the growth was jobless. That is what people are talking about. But over the past 13 years, there has been no growth in the economy and no job creation. So we can't say jobless growth because there hasn't been any growth in per capita terms over the past 13 years. What I can't understand is that the Asian countries, they had a similar skills situation and education situation than we have, but they created jobs for the skills that they had and not the skills that they wish they had. And I was reading the biography of Lee Kuan Yew, and he says that the first initiative met a businessman who had an idea when he started after Singapore's independence. And this businessman, he just said, listen, I want something that's going to create jobs. And the first business they started was to make fish hooks. So you start where the people are and you change the structure of the economy to create the jobs that are appropriate for the profile of your unemployed people. And you talked about textiles. In those countries, they also did labor-intensive textile industries, which became exporters. I was reading recently, Bangladesh is successfully doing that now. So what happens in those countries, as you move and you start educating your population, you move away from those labor-intensive industries and you move up the value chain, and then it moves on to countries like Bangladesh. Yeah. I just think we have to come up with a proper plan. We can achieve 100% renewable, I think, in about 10 years, if we were serious about it. We can create many jobs through this decarbonization situation in our economy. There's so many things that we can do to grow our economy and create the jobs. I believe we also need to have universal public services. We have to expand the care economy. We have to create free education, free healthcare, and we must equalize our two healthcare systems. According to my calculations, the shortages in terms of nurses, doctors, whatever, if we are to create the appropriate ratios between doctors and population and nurses and population, I think our shortfalls are about 400,000. So we have to expand public services significantly. And then we have to have mass housing, mass transport. So these are some of the things that I think that we can do. There's so many ideas that we can do. But in the meantime, I have to say, we have to have some way of addressing the immediate humanitarian crisis. And I'm a big advocate of the basic income grant that we should be implementing for the people between ages of 18 and 59, because it will take a while for us to create jobs for every single South African.
How do we pay for all this, Duma? When such issues are brought up, you often hear that question that we already have this small tax base in South Africa. So how do we pay for it?
Last year during the crisis, countries spent 16 trillion rands on stimulus packages. That was 17% of global GDP. Every single country that implemented a stimulus could not afford it, number one. I look at Brazil, which had a higher debt to GDP ratio than South Africa, which implemented a much more vigorous stimulus for their economy. And what happened there in many of these countries is that the central banks of these countries, in the rich countries, they financed the stimulus packages. The central bank money creation was about 15% of GDP. I've just done a paper for Naledi, the think tank of COSATU, for the public sector wage bill, and I came up with 11 options of how we can finance the stimulus that I'm talking about. Number one, the central bank, if we had a proper one, can create the money at no cost. They can print the money. That is number one. And number two, the central bank can be involved in what is called quantitative easing, where they buy government bonds on the bond market. Number three, they can be provided with, the central bank can lend money directly to companies and the government. We see it with the Bank of England. They provided loans to companies that were in trouble. They provided loans to football clubs. Arsenal and Tottenham Hotspurs took loans from the Bank of England. The US, they provided loans to municipalities, to local government. In China, the People's Bank of China provided loans to hospitals. So we need to change this monetary policy framework. We have to have a central bank that is geared towards economic development and job creation. So job creation must be part of this mandate of the central bank, because the central bank can be involved in creating the jobs. The second issue I want to say is that if you look at fiscal policy, our debt to GDP ratio is 80.3%. That is not high by international standards, because every single country after the coronavirus had a similar hit to their GDP as we did. The world average debt to GDP ratio is about 100%, and in rich countries, it's about 120%. So our debt is not high by international standards. We can borrow more money. And the other thing I want to say is that in the budget, we have got about 292 billion rands cash in terms of government's bank account. Some of that can be released into the economy. We also have foreign exchange reserves of 800 billion rands. We do not need so much foreign exchange reserves. I calculate that we can release about half of those foreign exchange reserves into the economy, 400 billion rands. And then our public investment corporation is overfunded. It's got assets of about 2.2 trillion. And I made certain recommendations as to how we can reduce the funding of the PIC and release money into the economy. There are many things that we can do as a country. Basically, what people need to understand is that government's budget does not operate like a household budget, because if the government spends money into the economy, it gets the money back. If the government spends R1 billion, they get 150 million rands from that, and they create jobs and people pay tax from those jobs. So people must understand they mustn't make these analogies between the household debt and the government debt. The International Monetary Fund calculated that when the government spends $1 on infrastructure, it grows the economy by $2.7. That is what I'm trying to say, is that I think the problem we make is we make these analogies with our household or company budget.
So why do our political leaders not seem to understand that and make those decisions? Because at the moment, it seems as if we are just peddling water. No one seems to know what is happening or how to get out of this quagmire that we're in. Why are we unwilling or unable to take these decisions and just do something, help people get this country working again?
Nonto, there's no way out of this crisis, and I say this on every soapbox, except to spend more money into the economy. When there's a recession, there's not enough money in the economy by definition. We have the resources in South Africa. I didn't even mention, we've got a huge financial sector of about, I think it's 20 trillion rands. We can redirect through legislative means some of that surplus, some of those funds in the financial sector towards development through prescribed asset requirements on the financial sector, which has been done in other countries. You know, in China, they have quotas for bank lending. We can do things like that. You know, why do they do that? I think it's a political purpose. Austerity is a political choice. If the government is broke, then they have to privatize everything. The government has to privatize Eskom, they have to privatize Transnet. But what we are saying is that the government is not broke. A government that has a central bank that controls its currency, it cannot become broke because the central bank can create money.
But that sounds very careless, Duma, because then you are suggesting there is a political reason for leaving people in poverty and not have the most basic needs met.
I don't understand, Nonto, because I listen to the president talk and he says we are fiscally constrained. You know, every time he talks, he says, no, they reduce the grants for the people. But I don't understand. We give them option after option. People have talked about a wealth tax. A wealth tax can generate 200 billion rands. And I've seen so many proposals. The social security tax, I saw from the IEJ, would generate 64 billion rands. We can do a financial transactions tax. There are so many alternatives in civil society, and I can't even name all of them. But the government is tone deaf, mute, and they don't want to listen to any of those alternatives. I think South Africans must begin to start asking questions. Why, in the face of so many proper alternatives, well-argued alternatives, the government is not listening? Maybe I can only assume that there's this agenda of privatization, and it requires a government that is broke here.
What role can we as individuals play? What role can the private sector play? I mean, there's a lot of money sitting in the private sector. What should they be doing?
Well, as I was saying, like if you look at our capital markets, we've got one of the deepest capital market in the world, you know, as a percentage of GDP. So our stock exchange is 17 billion rand worth of it. Our bond market is 3 billion rand. So our financial market is about 20 billion rands. And then our banks, they've got assets of about 6 trillion rands. So now I'm saying that we should, through prescribed assets or through agreement with them, say 10% or whatever of your assets must be geared towards infrastructure. Now, that happens in many Asian countries where they have quotas for, you know what, the thing in Patagabhlungu is that when I look at the figures for bank lending to Black SMMEs, you know, and Black women SMMEs, the last time I looked in the latest one, their total loan book, remember they've got assets of 6 trillion, their total loan book towards the majority of Black SMMEs was something like, was it 20 billion rands or something? That is 0.5% of their total assets. So we could legislate a quota for bank lending to Black SMMEs. We could legislate quotas for the banks and the insurance. How much are you supposed to invest in infrastructure, in SMMEs, Black SMMEs? How much are you supposed to invest in climate change and so, whatever, you know? But I believe that the time has come.
Scared of taking those decisions?
I think they are scared.
More like the Asian giants?
Yes. Yes, because every year in China, they set quotas for the bank lending as to this will go to property. And when the property is overheating, they say, no, we're moving now to something else. So that happened in all of these Asian countries where the banks were directed. In fact, when you look at these countries, Nonto, most of their stimulus and the development happened from the banking sector because the government had control over the banking sector. A couple of years, I've been to China a couple of times, and I did some analysis. The state ownership of the banks, I think 70%. But in the other Asian countries, there was big state influence over the banking sector. You need a robust central bank. You also need some level of influence over the financial sector because the financial sector creates money as well.
But are you now advocating for the nationalization of the banks?
No, what I'm talking about is that the government, the Public Investment Corporation, the last time I looked, they already own shares in most of the banks. So we already have quite a significant shareholding of the banks. We can use our board seats on those banks to help the strategy towards development. What the PIC could probably do is to consolidate its assets in one bank and one insurer. The government is talking about the state bank. We need a people's bank that is backed by the central bank that is going to fund our development. We need to restructure this financial sector. It must become more diverse. You saw in Tabeleng and Mutual Bank, but we have to have cooperative banks, mutual banks. We need to have banks in the townships, local community banks. We should have different banks and different financial institutions that serve people's needs. In China, they have got rural credit schemes for people there to farm and all that. So we have to diversify and smash this monopoly that is just controlling the banking sector, because most of the lending that they do, it's not productive. It is financing the purchase of existing assets. So when they finance your mortgage, you must buy a house that already exists. That doesn't add to job creation. So we must find a way to steer the flows of the financial sector towards actual economic development here.
You don't seem willing to make those types of decisions and to change from how things have always been to a new way of thinking, a new way of approaching situations. It's as if we are just holding the fort, as it were, and letting things continue as if we are not in this crisis that we're in, and yes, somehow miraculously it will all disappear.
Yes, now I was looking at the ESCOM crisis. So they said that they will create 5,000 megawatts of electricity in 3 years through these renewable energy projects. Then I'm thinking, at that cost, what will it collect to achieve 100% renewable? It will cost more than R1 trillion. So why don't we create that as a project that is going to drive our economy? And then what does that mean? Our public transport system must become green as well. We must change the taxes, they must become green. So those are the type of spin-off effects that would have on the economy. And then, I traveled on this train in China between Beijing and Shanghai. And that thing they built over 10 years, it cost $300 billion. But when you drive on it, you see what impact it had on the development of that country. And the company that does the rail is making losses. So we need to upgrade, our rail system, our public rail system has completely been decimated. Our public transport system, we have to make major investments in the infrastructure in terms of transport. And there's a lot of unmet needs and aspirations of our people in terms of mass housing. So those are some of the things that we have to talk about. But we also need to have some more control over the private sector. We can set up this People's Bank. I saw the Green Party in Australia is proposing a People's Bank that's banked by the central bank. So we can do something similar in South Africa. Yeah.
How do we close the gap between just hearing these statistics and not caring about them, and translating that to real human beings, people with hopes and aspirations, and realizing that but for the grace of God, that could be us?
The saddest moment I saw during the crisis last year was when the private schools, the minority 4%, they continued with their education as if nothing happened. But then the children who go to the public schools, their schools were shut. And those are the type of inequalities in our situation. They are unacceptable. I believe that we must equalize education and health. It must be one education system where there won't be a need for your child to go to a private school. We must have one health system. We cannot continue to tolerate these inequalities. My father's side of the family comes from Garega in the Eastern Cape. And when you look at the condition of the schools there, it is disgraceful. and the hospitals in the Eastern Cape. It is unbelievable. The government announces that they're going to increase the threshold for embedded generation. It's just going to drive inequality because a few companies, large mines, are going to have 24/7 electricity, and a few rich people who can get off the grid are going to have 24/7 electricity. But the majority of us, we're going to be served by Eskom. We've got 11.4 million unemployed people, and they continue like nothing has happened, you know.
I just found it confounding that we keep doing the same things over and over again and hoping for a different outcome when we have seen that it's not working. So it doesn't make sense to me why we keep doing that.
I just, like when I listen to the president and he repeats the stuff, it's like he really believes it, that if we don't have money, we must have structural reforms, we must have austerity. Where has that ever ended properly? Where has that ever in the world delivered results? It's incapable of delivering results. I speak a lot in public forums to different organizations spreading the message. And I just think all of us, we must take an interest in the economic side of things. We get to spend too much time talking about the political sideshow in South Africa, and we must now focus on economic empowerment. You must ask, why is it that there is no funding for Black SMMEs? You must ask the questions that are relevant to your situation. And once you ask those questions, then you'll begin to connect the dots as to what's happening in our country.
It really breaks my heart, honestly. I mean, you drive and there are people sitting on the side of the road with paint brushes and ladders trying to get a job. And you go into the townships, there's all these young men sitting on street corners. Thank you so much, Duma, for giving us this time.
Thank you so much, Nonto. Yeah.